In other news, polling has closed in Singapore, where voters turned out in large numbers to decide whether the long-ruling People's Action Party (PAP) will maintain its dominance or face a stronger challenge from a growing opposition. The vote is the first electoral test for Prime Minister Lawrence Wong, who took over from long-time Premier Lee Hsien Loong as the leader of the PAP in May last year. The party is almost certain to dominate and win most seats, as it has in every vote since Singapore's independence in 1965. However, its share of the popular vote will be closely watched after one of its worst electoral performances in 2020. That's when the last elections were held in Singapore. The Workers' Party, led by 49-year-old lawyer Pritham Singh, is the largest among the opposition parties, though it alone possesses no major threat to the PAP's rule. It has steadily perhaps gained ground in the past few elections, with an unprecedented 6 seats in Parliament in 2011 and 2015 and 10 seats in 2020.
Well, I think the PAP is very, very conscious that, having been around for more than 6 decades, there's always the threat of becoming complacent and ossification. And that's why even Lawrence Wong, mentioned that the November 2024 party conference marking the 70th anniversary of the party's founding, that, nobody should take for granted that the PAP will continue to be government.
The opposition is taking aim at Wong's PAP over rising living cost and also housing availability, a perennial problem in Singapore, among the world's most expensive cities. The PAP has sought to counter this with a raft of giveaways in February's budget, including groceries, vouchers, tax rebates and cash handouts.
The housing issue in Singapore is a big issue. I feel like they brought a lot of good points. Hopefully, in the next few years, a lot of changes will be made so that younger folks like myself are able to get a housing sooner and more affordable.
The election comes at a time when Singapore faces uncertainty in its trade-reliant economy and the possibility of recession and job losses caused by US President Donald Trump's tariffs. Voting, Wong has rather pledged more financial support if Singapore's economy suffers collateral damage from global trade tensions. And for more on this, we are now being joined by Dr. Bridget Welsh, who is currently Honorary Research Associate with the University of Nottingham in Malaysia. Welcome to WION, Dr. Welsh.
Great to be here.
Now, Dr. Welsh, this election in Singapore is perhaps not about who will win, but rather a test for the ruling party against rejuvenated opposition. First up, do you think that the opposition will be able to make inroads? And what would a weak mandate for the PAP party mean?
Well, there are 2 GRCs. So Singapore has 33 constituencies, one of which has been a walkover. So there are 32 constituencies. There are 11 parties contesting in the opposition, but the one that is actually the strongest is the one you mentioned earlier, the Workers' Party. And it is contesting in multiple GRCs, which are group constituencies. So the aim for the Workers' Party is to try to pick up at least one of the GRCs from the 2 that they already have. So they're totally contesting in 26 seats. There are 2 very close fights, one in the northern part of Singapore and one in the eastern part of Singapore. And these are the seats that are being closely watched because one of the markers of potential loss for PAP is to lose at least one of these GRCs. The second marker is the popular vote. And now, in most standards globally, anyone who wins at least 60% of the vote, it's a landslide. Well, in Singapore, the marker is to whether or not the popular vote will go below 60%. And this is what people are watching. My own sense, having been on the ground in Singapore, the weaker opposition parties will give a bit of boost in some of the other seats to the PAP. It's what's going to be interesting is to watch the very close races where the Workers' Party is trying to double or increase their voice in Parliament. And those are the seats to watch, especially with younger voters there.
Welsh, you mentioned the popular vote, and 60% was the threshold in 2020 during the Singapore elections then. I want to ask you that, do you think with Wong as the new Prime Minister, do you think that this is a referendum on Prime Minister Lawrence Wong as well?
Well, unfortunately for the PAP, I think they've made a bit of a risk by making this the campaign message. So it's Lawrence Wong's picture that you often find in the constituencies. And that, in a sense, has put a heavy burden on Lawrence Wong, who's only been prime minister for a year, even though he's been part of the PAP and played a very important role during the COVID pandemic for a long time. But I think that is going to be a difficult test, because you see, in this regard, for the first time, Singapore doesn't have a prominent Lee name in the senior leadership. And this, in a sense, is a real test for the People's Action Party compared to the past.
My last question to you, Dr. Welsh. Singapore is one of the expensive cities in the world. What are some of the key issues that dominated the polls this time around? And keeping in mind how trade is also key to Singapore's growth, how much of the Trump factor has played out in the polls this time?
Good questions. The first thing is that it is very much the dominant issue is cost of living. Prices in Singapore have really skyrocketed. And as you mentioned earlier, it's one of the most expensive cities. And, you know, a large section of the population, their wages have only increased modestly. And there is a lot of economic vulnerability in Singapore, despite the fact that it is overall has a high GDP. The other issue is housing for younger people, but for many people now, Singapore is a very different society than it was before. There's a calls for greater political accountability. So if the opposition does pick up any seats, it's because their argument has been that they want to have greater voices of diversity and perspectives in Parliament, and to have more of a check on the People's Action Party in terms of policies and discussions. So I think these types of issues are going to be crucial. Right. Now, the big question is the Trump effect, right? We've seen in Australia the Trump effect, in Canada the Trump effect. But in Singapore, the Trump effect is a different way. It favors the PAP. And we'll see whether or not the Trump effect is effective for Lawrence Wong, because he's been pushing this issue of economic insecurity as a reason to give him a mandate that is strong. Of course, as I mentioned earlier, a strong mandate in Singapore is an extremely strong mandate in their perception. And
right, Dr. Welsh, thank you so much for joining us on WION and sharing your insights with us on Singapore's election.
Most welcome.